This is a slow and quiet retelling of familiar Greek myths. You don't need to focus, you don't need to remember names, and you don't need to stay awake. These stories are told softly, without urgency, and without anything important happening too quickly. You may recognize some of these myths. You may already know how they end. That's perfectly fine. Tonight, the details don't matter, the order doesn't matter, even the meaning doesn't matter. The words are simply here to move slowly, one after another, while you rest. We'll begin with a familiar myth about the changing of the seasons. This is the story of Persephone, told softly and without drama. This is a slow and quiet retelling of familiar Greek myths. You don't need to focus, you don't need to remember names, and you don't need to stay awake. These stories are told softly, without urgency, and without anything important happening too quickly. You may recognize some of these myths. You may already know how they end. That's perfectly fine. Tonight, the details don't matter, the order doesn't matter, even the meaning doesn't matter. The words are simply here to move slowly, one after another, while you rest. We'll begin with a familiar myth about the changing of the seasons. This is the story of Persephone, told softly and without drama. Persephone was the daughter of Demeter. Demeter was associated with fields, harvests, and the steady growth of plants. Her presence was felt across the land, not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. Their days followed a predictable rhythm. Morning arrived slowly. Light shifted without drawing attention to itself. There was no clear beginning to the day, only a gradual sense that time was moving forward. The land changed slowly. Seeds were planted at familiar times in familiar places. They were covered with soil, left alone, and allowed to do what seeds had always done. Crops grew without instruction. No one needed to watch them closely. No one needed to interfere. Time passed without needing attention. Persephone spent most of her days walking through open fields and quiet meadows. She walked without destination, without urgency, and without expectation. These walks were not planned, they simply happened. Some days she followed the same path as the day before. Other days she took a slightly different route, though the difference hardly mattered. There was nothing urgent about these walks. They happened often, and they followed familiar paths that felt worn not by footsteps, but by repetition. Flowers grew where they always had. Their colors were familiar. Their shapes did not change. The air felt the same from one day to the next. Sometimes warmer, sometimes cooler, but never surprising. Nothing suggested that things would change. Demeter watched over the land carefully but without anxiety. Her attention was steady, not intense. She did not rush, she did not worry. Growth happened when it was supposed to. Not early, not late. Rest followed work naturally. When the land needed time, it was given time. Persephone's presence was gentle and unremarkable by divine standards. She was not known for causing disruption. She did not alter the balance of things. She was simply there, moving through ordinary moments, allowing them to pass without resistance. Days blended together. One walk resembled the next. One afternoon felt much like another, and because nothing demanded attention, nothing stood out. At some point, during one of these ordinary days, Persephone wandered slightly farther than usual, not because she was curious, not because she was searching for something, simply because the path continued. The ground remained steady beneath her feet. The soil felt the same as it always had. The sky looked the same as it always had. There were no signs, no warnings. The air did not change, and then, without warning, Hades appeared. There was no dramatic announcement, no sound that demanded attention, no sudden chaos. The earth opened quietly, as if it had done so many times before. Hades emerged, not with urgency, not with anger, but with certainty. It was not rushed. It was not delayed. He took Persephone with him, not hurriedly, not violently, but firmly enough that there was no confusion about what was happening. There was no struggle that needed remembering, no moment that required explanation. The earth closed again. The field returned to stillness. The flowers remained where they were. The sky did not change. The path looked exactly the same as before. Demeter noticed Persephone's absence gradually, not immediately, not with panic. At first, it simply felt quieter than usual. The land still existed. The fields were still there, but something was missing. Days passed. Demeter continued her routines, walking through the same spaces, checking the same fields. Everything appeared unchanged, and yet something felt incomplete. When she realized Persephone was gone, her grief did not arrive all at once. It did not overwhelm her. It settled slowly, like a weight that became noticeable only after time. As Demeter searched, the land responded, not dramatically, not all at once. Plants stopped growing as eagerly. They still grew, but without enthusiasm. Fields became less productive, not barren but quieter. The rhythm of the seasons slowed. This wasn't punishment, it wasn't anger, there was no intention behind it. It was simply neglect. Demeter no longer focused on growth. Her attention was elsewhere, and without her attention, the land rested. Eventually, the absence became impossible to ignore. The land grew colder. Not suddenly, but steadily. Crops failed to appear where they once had. The soil felt heavier. Time itself felt slower. The other gods noticed. Not immediately, but eventually. Conversations happened. Decisions were made without urgency. And so, a compromise was reached. Persephone would spend part of the year above ground and part of the year below. There was no celebration, no dramatic resolution. It was simply agreed upon. When Persephone returned, Demeter's attention returned with her. Plants grew again, gradually. Fields recovered without announcement. Warmth followed. When Persephone left, the land rested. Not in sorrow, not in anger, just in stillness. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, just a slow cycle repeating itself year after year. And this is how the seasons came to be, not through conflict, but through routine, not through urgency, but through repetition. It is a story that has no surprises left. Everything happens as expected, and that predictability is what allows the world to continue quietly. The underworld did not feel as Persephone had imagined it might. There was no sudden darkness, no sharp change. Instead, everything felt muted. Light existed, but without direction. It did not come from above, and it did not move. Time behaved differently here. There were no clear mornings, no evenings that needed to arrive. Persephone's days, if they could be called days, settled into a quiet repetition. She moved through long halls that did not seem to begin or end anywhere specific. Stone surfaces felt cool beneath her hands, not cold, just steady. Nothing demanded her attention. Hades was present, but rarely urgent. He did not follow her closely. He did not speak often. His presence felt constant, not imposing, not absent. Persephone was given space. She spent much of her time walking as she had above ground. The paths were different, but the act of walking felt familiar. Corridors extended quietly. Rooms opened into other rooms. Some spaces felt larger than others, but none of them felt important. There was no expectation that she needed to go anywhere in particular. She noticed that sounds behaved differently. Footsteps did not echo loudly. They softened quickly. Voices, when they appeared, were distant and unhurried. Nothing startled her. Even silence felt gentle. Persephone learned the rhythm of the underworld slowly. Not through instruction, not through explanation, simply through repetition. She would wake when it felt appropriate, not because time required it. She would walk, pause, stand still for a while. Sometimes she would sit and observe the stillness around her. Nothing changed quickly. And because nothing changed, there was no need to remember details. Uraltanin Gundelik Duzeni meals appeared without ceremony. They were simple, predictable. She did not feel rushed to eat. She did not feel watched. Afterward, time continued, not forward, not backward, just onward. The underworld did not try to hold her attention. It existed without asking anything in return. Hades spoke occasionally, his voice calm, measured. There was no pressure in his words. Conversations did not require response. They simply happened and then ended. Persephone listened, but did not feel the need to react. Days blended together. One walk felt like another. One hall resembled the next. Nothing stood out enough to mark a beginning or an ending. And slowly, Persephone stopped waiting. She stopped expecting change. Routine replaced anticipation. The underworld became familiar not because it was welcoming, but because it was consistent. Persephone's days in the underworld continued to unfold without distinction. If one moment ended, there was no clear signal that another had begun. She walked through the same corridors again, not because she intended to, but because the paths always led back to places she already knew. Stone walls remained unchanged. Their surfaces felt the same beneath her fingertips. Cool, steady, unresponsive. Nothing in the underworld reacted to her presence. Nothing followed her movements. She was there, and the space allowed it. Sometimes she paused, not because she was tired, but because stopping felt no different from moving. Silence remained complete. It did not press against her. It did not ask to be filled. Even her own footsteps softened quickly, as if the ground absorbed sound before it could travel. Time did not stretch forward. It did not pull backward. It settled around her evenly. She no longer thought of herself as waiting. Waiting required expectation. Expectation no longer belonged here. Routine replaced it. Walking, pausing, standing still, occasionally sitting and letting nothing happen. Meals continued to appear without pattern that needed remembering. They arrived as they always had, simple, unremarkable. She ate without hurry, she stopped without thought. Nothing changed afterward. Hades remained present in the same quiet way. He did not check on her. He did not instruct her. When he spoke, his voice did not interrupt the space. Words existed briefly, then dissolved back into stillness. There was no obligation to respond. Conversation did not move anything forward, it simply passed. And because nothing progressed, nothing felt delayed. Above ground, Demeter's movements continued out of habit rather than intention. She still walked the fields, she still observed the land. But her attention no longer settled fully on any single detail. At first, the change was subtle. A plant that once would have been adjusted was left alone. A field that once would have been revisited waited longer. Nothing failed immediately. Growth continued, but it did so quietly, without insistence. Demeter did not notice the difference right away. The land did not announce it. The seasons did not protest. They simply loosened. Warm days passed without intensity. Cool nights arrived and lingered slightly longer. Autumn did not replace summer, it overlapped with it. Leaves stayed longer on branches, then fell without urgency. Demeter allowed this, not as a decision. As an absence of correction, winter did not arrive sharply, there was no boundary. Cold settled gradually, soil hardened slowly. Snow did not cover everything at once. It layered itself gently, as if resting. Demeter did not resist the stillness. She did not push the land forward, he let it pause. Above ground, the world slept longer. Below ground, nothing noticed the difference. Persephone continued her routine. The underworld did not respond to the changing seasons above. It did not brighten, it did not darken. It remained consistent, and that consistency became familiar, not comforting, not unsettling, simply known. Eventually, the idea of movement between worlds returned without urgency, not as a request, not as a demand, as a continuation of pattern. The agreement did not interrupt anything, it fit neatly into what already existed. Persephone accepted it without reaction. Acceptance required no effort here. When the time came to leave, nothing resisted her departure. The corridors did not change. The silence did not shift. She moved upward without ceremony. The transition did not mark itself. Light adjusted slowly. Texture softened gradually. Above ground, the land responded before Demeter did. Soil loosened. Air warmed slightly. Growth did not begin, it resumed. Demeter noticed without surprise. Persephone returned as gently as she had left. No announcement, no reunion that needed memory. Attention returned to the land naturally. Growth followed, slowly, predictably. And when it was time for Persephone to leave again, the release was just as gentle. No resistance, no grief that demanded expression. The cycle had established itself. It did not improve, it did not decay, it repeated. Above ground, growth and rest continued in balance. Below ground, stillness remained unchanged. Neither world asked for attention, neither required resolution. And if the story feels distant now, that is expected. It was never meant to hold focus. It was meant to continue whether it was noticed or not. Nothing more needs to happen. The cycle is already complete. The rhythm continued without needing reinforcement. Above ground and below, nothing asked to be accelerated. Persephone's movements in the underworld became even more indistinct over time. She could no longer say whether she had walked a path moments ago or much earlier. The corridors offered no reference. Their length did not matter. Their direction did not matter. They existed so that movement could happen without destination. Sometimes she walked slowly. Sometimes she paused longer than before. The difference had no consequence. The underworld did not respond to pacing. It accepted all movement equally. Stillness felt the same as motion. She would stand and allow the space around her to remain unchanged. There was no sense that she needed to move again. And yet, movement returned on its own, not as intention. As continuation, the stone beneath her feet held a steady temperature. It never warmed, it never cooled. The air carried no scent that required attention. Breathing became quieter, not shallower. Just less noticeable. If a thought appeared, it passed without forming a sequence. There was no reason to follow it. Hades remained part of the background, not as a figure to focus on. As a constant presence that did not interfere. When he appeared, he did so without altering the space. When he was absent, nothing felt missing. Words, when they existed, did not connect to action. They rested briefly in the air and then disappeared. Nothing followed them. Nothing preceded them. Above ground, Demeter's release of the seasons continued in the same unforced way. She no longer marked time by growth. She no longer corrected small imbalances. The land adjusted gradually to the absence of guidance. Fields did not fail, they softened. Growth occurred without insistence. Rest extended without resistance. Days felt longer because nothing pushed them forward. Nights blended into mornings without distinction. Cold did not arrive, it lingered. Warmth did not depart, it faded. Demeter did not observe these changes closely. She moved through them without urgency. Her presence no longer anchored the land to productivity, and so the land learned how to wait. Snow remained until it no longer needed to. Soil rested until it loosened on its own. Nothing signaled when one state ended and another began. The transition lived in the space between. Below ground, Persephone adjusted without noticing the adjustment. Routine had replaced awareness. Walking was no longer an action. It was simply what happened between pauses. The underworld did not resist her familiarity. It did not change in response to it. It remained as it always had. And because it remained, it became easier to stop noticing details. Walls did not need to be remembered. Paths did not need to be followed. Nothing here required memory. Time continued without shape. Above and below, two forms of stillness settled into place. One covered in soil and seasons, the other carved from stone and silence. Neither rushed, neither waited. They simply held, and the cycle continued without needing to be observed. Nothing interrupted the balance. The world above did not ask to be renewed. The world below did not ask to be escaped. They remained as they were. Persephone no longer distinguished between standing and waiting. Both felt identical. Her body adjusted to the absence of urgency. Movement no longer implied progress. Stillness no longer implied pause. They became interchangeable. Sometimes she leaned against cool stone surfaces, not to rest. Rest had already happened, just to feel the steadiness beneath her. The stone did not respond, it did not shift, it did not echo her presence. It existed without acknowledgement. This made it easier to let go of intention. There was no reason to decide what came next. The underworld offered no cues, no clocks, no light that suggested change. If time passed, it did so without leaving marks. Persephone's awareness softened, not fading, spreading. Thoughts no longer followed each other. They appeared as isolated moments, then dissolved. Nothing required completion. Nothing needed to be carried forward. Hades passed through the space occasionally, not approaching, not retreating. When he spoke, his voice did not alter the stillness. Words were placed carefully, then left behind. They did not linger. They did not invite response. Conversation existed without exchange. Afterward, silence returned without effort. Above ground, Demeter walked less. Not because she was tired, because movement no longer changed outcomes. The fields no longer waited for her presence. They rested in place. Growth occurred when conditions allowed. Decline occurred without conflict. Demeter observed this without judgment. The land was not failing. It was pausing. Seasons lost their edges. Autumn did not begin, it drifted. Winter did not arrive, it settled. Spring did not announce itself. It unfolded quietly. There were no markers, no transitions worth naming, just gradual shifts that did not ask to be tracked. Demeter's attention rested inward. Not in sorrow, not in anticipation, simply elsewhere, and because her attention moved away, the land learned to remain without direction. Below ground, Persephone stopped waiting for return, not because she had given up, because waiting required an expectation. Expectation no longer fit within the rhythm. She existed within repetition, not boredom. Familiarity. The halls no longer felt long, the spaces no longer felt closed. They were just spaces, and she moved through them because movement continued. Breath followed breath. Steps followed steps. Pause followed pause. Nothing urged the pattern forward, nothing pulled it apart. Above and below, the two worlds continued without dialogue. They did not mirror each other. They did not oppose each other. They simply coexisted. The balance did not need reinforcement. It held because nothing disturbed it. And as the cycle extended, it became easier to stop listening for change. Easier to let the story remain unfinished. Easier to stay exactly where nothing happens. There was no signal that anything needed to change. The rhythm did not accelerate. It did not slow further. It simply continued at the pace it had settled into. Persephone noticed that even noticing had become unnecessary. Awareness existed without focus. Thoughts appeared without asking to be followed. They dissolved without needing closure. The underworld remained consistent. Stone felt the same no matter how often it was touched. Distance meant nothing. Direction meant nothing. Walking and standing required the same amount of effort. Sometimes Persephone stopped moving without deciding to stop. Her body paused before intention formed, and nothing corrected this. Nothing demanded alignment. Nothing waited. Above ground, the land held its breath without realizing it had done so. Snow did not melt quickly. Ice did not resist melting. Water moved when it was able to. Soil accepted it without response. Demeter did not intervene, not out of sadness, not out of refusal. Intervention no longer fit into the rhythm. The land had learned how to exist without constant guidance. Growth became occasional, rest became primary. Neither state claimed importance. Seasons overlapped. One did not replace another. They blurred. A cool morning did not imply winter. A warm afternoon did not imply spring. Weather happened without meaning. Demeter observed this without naming it. Naming would have required attention. Attention would have required intention. Intention had softened. Below ground, Persephone's presence no longer felt like arrival. She was simply there, not placed, not held, not waiting to be moved. Her existence did not interrupt the space. The space did not accommodate her. They shared duration. Hades remained constant, neither closer nor farther. When he appeared, he did not alter the atmosphere. When he left, nothing followed him. Authority existed without enforcement. Power existed without motion. The underworld did not insist on silence. Silence happened because nothing competed with it. Above and below, time continued without measurement. No one counted cycles. No one anticipated return. The agreement between worlds existed quietly, not as a promise, as a condition. Persephone would move when the cycle allowed. Demeter would respond when attention returned. Until then, both worlds remained in suspension, not frozen, not progressing, simply present. And because nothing pressed forward, it became easier to release the idea of sequence. Beginning and ending lost relevance. What mattered was the continuation of calm repetition. A state where nothing concludes. A state where nothing begins, only the steady permission to remain. Nothing asked for momentum. Nothing resisted stillness. The balance had already settled into something that did not need correction. Persephone moved through the underworld with less awareness of movement itself. Steps happened without being counted. Distance did not accumulate. She did not arrive anywhere. She did not leave anything behind. Corridors extended without destination. Walls existed without enclosing. The space did not feel empty. It felt complete without content. Her breathing followed a pattern that did not need regulation. Inhale, exhale, pause. The pause lingered longer than the breath itself, and nothing filled it. Silence did not press inward. It expanded outward, thoughts thinned, not disappearing, spacing themselves farther apart. They became less specific. Less tied to memory, more like impressions that did not attach. Persephone sometimes remained still long enough that movement lost its appeal, not because she was resting. Rest implied effort beforehand. Here, effort had already dissolved. Her presence became another fixed element of the space, not noticeable, not absent, just consistent. Hades' domain continued without supervision. No adjustments were made, no orders were given, authority remained implicit. Nothing challenged it, nothing required it. The underworld functioned because it had always functioned. Above ground, the land entered a similar state. Demeter no longer walked with intention. She passed through fields without correcting them. She noticed variation without responding. A plant grew unevenly. A field rested longer than expected. Water pooled, then receded. No pattern demanded enforcement. Growth occurred in fragments. Rest filled the gaps. The seasons loosened further. Spring did not gather momentum. Summer did not peak. Autumn did not decline. Winter did not conclude. They overlapped without hierarchy. Days lost their role as markers. Light shifted without instruction. Demeter allowed this without naming it loss. Nothing had been taken. Nothing was missing. The land had not failed. It had slowed into a sustainable quiet. Below ground, Persephone no longer distinguished between before and after. Memory softened, not erased, just unnecessary. She did not recall how long she had walked. She did not anticipate how long she would remain. Time existed as a wide surface rather than a line. Standing within, it felt sufficient. Occasionally, sound appeared. Footsteps. A distant movement. A door opening somewhere unseen. Each sound faded without echo, without implication. They did not require attention. They did not break the stillness. They passed through it. Above and below, both worlds entered a similar quiet, not synchronized, not opposing, just parallel, each continuing without pressure. The cycle did not tighten. It did not demand resolution. It held open space for nothing to happen, and within that space, it became increasingly easy to stop tracking the story, to stop waiting for progression, to remain where repetition feels complete, where continuation does not imply delay, where nothing needs to change for balance to exist. The stillness no longer felt like an absence. It felt like a condition that everything else had adjusted to. Persephone's awareness rested without anchoring itself to any particular moment. There was no sense of arrival, no sense of waiting. Presence existed without context. She moved when movement occurred. She paused when pause happened. Neither action required intention. The underworld did not shift around her. It did not respond. It did not resist. It remained. Stone surfaces held the same temperature, not cold, not warm, consistent. Touch did not produce sensation. It confirmed continuity. Long stretches passed without differentiation. If time was moving, it did so evenly, without acceleration, without markers. Breath continued at a pace that did not change. Inhale blended into exhale. Exhale dissolved into silence. Between breaths there was space. That space widened. Nothing entered it. Nothing left it. Thoughts appeared as faint outlines. They did not form sequences. They did not demand memory. They passed through awareness without settling. Nothing insisted on being carried forward. Nothing asked to be concluded. Hades remained present in the same way the walls remained present. Not as a figure, as a constant. When his voice appeared, it did not disturb the environment. Words existed briefly, then faded. They left no trace. Authority required no reinforcement. The underworld functioned because it had always functioned. Above ground, the land mirrored a similar calm. Demeter observed without correction. Her steps did not guide growth. Her absence did not cause collapse. The fields existed independent of attention. Moisture gathered, then released. Soil hardened, then softened. Plants grew unevenly, then rested. No state claimed priority. No season demanded completion. Spring did not need to arrive. Winter did not need to leave. They blended quietly. Light shifted gradually. Morning did not announce itself. Evening did not insist on rest. Days became indistinct. Demeter's focus remained diffuse, not withdrawn, not concentrated, distributed. Her presence no longer regulated outcomes. The land learned to exist without expectation. Below ground, Persephone no longer identified with movement or stillness. Both existed as equal states. The concept of return lost its weight, not forgotten. Neutral, the agreement between worlds remained intact without being referenced. Cycles continued without being counted. Above and below, nothing waited for resolution. Nothing rushed toward it. The story no longer moved forward. It spread outward. Repetition became space. Space became familiarity. Familiarity became rest. And within that rest, it became possible to stop following, to remain without tracking, to let the rhythm continue without attention. Nothing concludes here. Nothing begins again. There is only the permission to stay exactly where calm has already settled. Nothing shifted enough to deserve attention. The state remained stable without reinforcement. Persephone existed within the space without defining herself against it. There was no contrast, no edge where she ended and the underworld began. Presence blended into environment. Movement occurred as a continuation of stillness. Stillness followed movement without interruption. Neither state held meaning. Long intervals passed without internal markers. If memory formed, it did not attach. It drifted, then released. Breathing continued without awareness. Air moved in. Air moved out. Between them, silence widened. The silence did not wait. It did not hold tension. It simply remained. Stone did not echo. Walls did not close in. Distance did not compress. Space did not expand. Everything stayed exactly as it was. And because it stayed, it became unnecessary to check whether anything had changed. Attention softened further. Observation dissolved into background presence. Persephone no longer occupied time, she shared it. There was no need to remember what came before, no reason to anticipate what followed. Hades' domain continued with quiet authority, not enforced, not challenged. Function existed without direction. The underworld did not perform, it persisted. Above ground, the land rested without instruction. Demeter's influence did not withdraw, it diffused. Fields were not guided, they were allowed. Growth appeared sporadically, rest filled the intervals. No cycle declared itself complete, no season concluded. They overlapped in long, indistinct stretches. Light moved without assigning meaning. Temperature shifted without urgency. Demeter did not correct this. Correction required priority. Priority no longer applied. The land did not decline, it stabilized at a slower rhythm. Above and below, both worlds entered a shared condition, not symmetry, not balance, coexistence. Nothing pressed forward, nothing resisted. The agreement between worlds remained implicit. Persephone would return when the cycle allowed. Demeter would respond when attention followed. Until then, continuation was sufficient. The story no longer unfolded, it rested. And within that rest, nothing needed to be followed. Nothing needed to be understood. Nothing needed to end. The calm was already complete. Above ground, Demeter continued to move through the land. At first, she did not stop. She walked the fields as she always had. She checked the soil. She observed the plants, but her attention drifted, not suddenly, not intentionally. Small details were missed. A field that once grew easily required more time. A season felt longer than it should have. Growth did not stop immediately, it hesitated. Demeter noticed this only after time had passed. She no longer corrected every imbalance, not because she chose not to, but because her focus was elsewhere. The land responded slowly. Plants grew, but without energy. Warm days felt shorter. Cool days arrived earlier. There was no single moment where everything changed, only a gradual release. Demeter's routines softened. Where she once stayed until growth was complete, she now left earlier. Where she once returned quickly, she delayed. And with each delay, the land rested a little more. Autumn lingered, not dramatically, just longer than expected. Leaves remained on branches, then fell without urgency. Winter arrived without announcement. The cold did not strike, it settled. Snow covered fields slowly, evenly. Demeter did not resist it. She allowed the stillness to remain. The land slept. Above and below, two routines continued. Persephone adjusted to the quiet repetition of the underworld. Demeter adjusted to the slowing of the seasons. Neither rushed, neither demanded resolution. Time continued without needing direction. Time continued to pass, both above and below. In the underworld, Persephone no longer counted anything. She did not measure how long she had been there. There was no reason to. The routines remained steady, walking, pausing, resting. Nothing asked more of her, and yet, without announcement, things began to shift. Not in the underworld itself, but in the understanding between worlds. The agreement did not arrive suddenly. It did not interrupt routine. It settled quietly like everything else. Persephone would return above ground for part of the cycle. She did not react strongly. There was no excitement, no urgency. It was simply something that would happen. When the time came, the transition was gentle. There was no rush to leave, no hesitation to stay. The halls remained as they were. The stillness did not resist her absence. Persephone moved upward without ceremony. Light changed gradually. Texture softened. Nothing marked the exact moment where one world ended and the other began. Above ground, Demeter felt the shift before she saw it. Not clearly, not immediately. The land responded first. Soil loosened. The air warmed slightly. Demeter noticed small changes without attaching meaning to them. Then Persephone returned, not suddenly, not dramatically. She simply appeared where she had once been. Demeter's attention followed naturally. There was no rush to restore everything at once. Growth resumed the way it always had, slowly. Plants did not grow instantly. They responded over time. Fields recovered without celebration. Warmth returned without intensity. Spring arrived not as an event, but as a condition. Demeter did not force it. She allowed it to unfold. And when Persephone's time came to return below, there was no resistance. Demeter released her gently. The land followed. And so the pattern continued. Persephone moved between worlds. Demeter adjusted the seasons. Nothing needed to be explained again. The cycle repeated without improvement and without decline. Above ground, the land grew and rested. Below ground, stillness remained unchanged. Neither world competed for attention. They simply existed in balance. This is how the seasons continue, not because they must, but because they always have. Nothing rushes them forward. Nothing pulls them back. They move slowly, predictably, and without surprise. And it's perfectly fine if you've lost track of where the story began or how it ended. The important part is that nothing needs to happen now. You can continue listening or you can rest. The cycle will carry on either way. That was the quiet story of Persephone and the seasons. A story without urgency and without anything that needs remembering. We'll continue soon with another familiar Greek myth, told just as softly. Orpheus was known for his music, but not in any remarkable way. The sound did not rise suddenly, and it did not fade with intention. It simply remained. When he played, the air adjusted around the notes without resistance. People did not stop what they were doing. They continued. The music existed alongside movement, alongside quiet conversations, alongside nothing at all. Orpheus played because his hands were used to it. The instrument rested against him as naturally as any other object he carried. Some days the strings felt familiar. Other days they felt exactly the same. There was no reason to think about it. He woke without urgency when light shifted enough to suggest that time had passed. There was no clear beginning to the day. He moved through familiar paths, his steps aligning with places he had walked through many times before. Sometimes he played while walking. Sometimes he stopped and stood still. Neither felt more correct than the other. The sound followed him, not leading, not trailing. It filled the space he occupied and then moved on. Eurydice was there, not as a moment of change, not as an interruption. She fit into the days without altering their shape. They walked together without deciding where to go. The ground felt the same beneath their feet, whether they spoke or not. Sometimes Orpheus played while Eurydice listened. Sometimes she did not listen closely. The music did not require attention. It continued. Days passed this way. One did not stand out from the next. Light arrived, shifted, and left. The air changed gradually. Orpheus continued to play. Eurydice continued to walk beside him. Nothing suggested that anything needed to be remembered. If a day felt longer, it passed. If a day felt shorter, it passed as well. The sound of the instrument settled into the background of everything else. People heard it and then forgot they were hearing it. The repetition made it easy. Time did not press forward, it simply moved. Eurydice's presence became expected. Because it was expected, it felt stable. And because it felt stable, it did not draw attention to itself. The days did not improve. They did not decline. They continued. Eurydice walked at the same pace each day, not because it was chosen, but because it was comfortable. Her steps aligned naturally with Orpheus's, sometimes slightly behind, sometimes beside him, without needing adjustment. They did not speak often. When they did, their words did not alter the rhythm of the day. Conversations began and ended without emphasis. Silence returned easily. Orpheus continued to play. The music did not announce itself. Notes repeated, not exactly, but closely enough that the difference did not matter. The sound settled into the air and stayed there for a while. Then it left, making room for the next sound. Eurydice listened without expectation. She did not wait for particular moments. She did not follow the structure. The music became part of the space rather than something happening within it. Time moved without marking itself. There were no clear beginnings. There were no clear endings. Days blended. The ground remained familiar. Paths did not change. If the light shifted, it did so gradually. If the air cooled, it happened slowly. Nothing asked to be noticed. Then, without a clear moment of change, Eurydice was no longer there. There was no sound that marked her absence, no interruption. Orpheus continued walking. His steps followed the same pattern. The music continued. At first, the space beside him felt unchanged. It took repetition for the difference to become noticeable. A pause lasted slightly longer. A note lingered where it usually did not. The air felt wider. Orpheus did not stop playing. Stopping would have required recognition. Recognition would have required adjustment. Adjustment did not feel necessary yet, so the music continued. Days passed. The space beside him remained empty, not suddenly, consistently. The absence settled as another element of the routine. Orpheus began to notice not what was missing, but what remained. The sound of the instrument, the familiar paths, the unchanging pace of his steps. Everything continued except for one thing, and because everything else remained, the difference grew clearer. The idea of following Eurydice did not arrive as a decision. It appeared as the next movement. Standing still felt less complete than walking, so Orpheus walked. The path changed gradually. The light softened. The ground sloped almost without being felt. Orpheus continued to play. The music adjusted itself to the space around it. Notes fell more quietly. Silence lasted a little longer between them. Nothing resisted him. Nothing guided him either. The descent did not feel final. It felt extended. The air grew still. The sound traveled differently. Creatures appeared and remained where they were. They did not approach. They did not retreat. They listened without reacting. The music passed through them and continued onward. Time did not behave differently. It moved as it always had. Orpheus kept walking. The ground leveled. The air held the sound longer. When he reached the place where others waited, no one spoke immediately. Hades remained still. Persephone remained beside him. They did not exchange glances. They did not shift their posture. The music continued. It did not change. It did not intensify. It remained. After some time had passed, long enough for the music to fill the space completely, permission was given. It was not announced. It was not explained. It was simply allowed. Eurydice stood behind Orpheus, not close enough to touch, not far enough to be absent. The space between them remained unchanged. Orpheus turned and began to walk. The path upward felt familiar. Steps followed steps. The ground rose gently. The light returned slowly. The silence between them stayed intact. There was no need for music. The sound had already done its work. Orpheus walked. Eurydice followed. The distance between them did not change. The air shifted. The light grew clearer. At some point, Orpheus turned, not quickly, not slowly. The movement felt natural. The space behind him was empty. There was no sound, no echo. The path remained. Orpheus stood. Then he walked again. The ascent continued without adjustment. Above ground, the days resumed. Orpheus returned to familiar paths. The instrument rested against him as it always had. He played. The music sounded the same. People listened. People passed by. Some stayed for a moment. Some did not. The repetition made it easy not to think about. Eurydice remained as absence, not as interruption, as part of the rhythm. The days continued. The sound continued. Nothing demanded resolution. Nothing required conclusion. The music filled the space and then left it unchanged. Orpheus did not change his routine after that. There was no reason to. The instrument was still there. His hands still knew where to move. The paths remained familiar. When he played, the sound behaved as it always had. It did not carry grief. It did not carry longing. It carried repetition. People continued to hear the music without stopping their work. Some recognized it, some didn't. The difference did not matter. Days continued to pass without separating themselves from one another. Light arrived, light faded. Orpheus walked. Orpheus played. The absence of Eurydice did not grow sharper. It settled, like a quiet space that no longer needed to be filled. The music adapted to that space without effort. Notes lingered and then moved on. Silence followed them and felt complete. Time did not ask for resolution. Nothing returned. Nothing needed to. And so the story of Orpheus and Eurydice did not end. It simply stopped changing. It became part of the world's background, like the sound of wind moving through familiar places or footsteps passing without being noticed. The music continued because that was what it did. And eventually, even the memory of following the story became unnecessary. You don't need to remember where it began. You don't need to follow what came before. The rhythm remains whether it's noticed or not. And while this quiet pattern continues, while sound becomes routine and absence becomes familiar, there are other stories moving just as slowly. Stories where effort repeats itself, where movement does not lead forward, where time circles instead of progressing. They do not announce themselves, they simply begin again. And somewhere, without urgency, without change, Another figure continues his work exactly as he always has. After that, the days did not reorganize themselves. They did not respond to what had happened. They continued as they had learned to continue. Orpheus woke when light entered the space where he rested, not fully, not clearly, just enough to suggest that time had shifted again. The instrument remained within reach. It always did. He did not check its condition. Checking would have implied concern. Concern would have implied difference. There was none. His hands moved the way they always had. Not deliberately, automatically, the strings responded without resistance. The sound emerged and settled into the air. It did not fill silence. It became part of it. People moved nearby. Some slowed briefly. Some did not notice at all. Both responses felt identical. The music did not ask to be heard. It existed whether attention followed it or not. Orpheus walked familiar paths. Each step landed where it had landed before. The ground offered no variation. The pace remained unchanged. The absence beside him no longer felt new. It did not draw awareness. It occupied space the way shadow occupies space. Present, unquestioned, not demanding, sometimes the music softened. Not intentionally. The sound adjusted itself to breathe. Sometimes it grew quieter, not because of restraint, because nothing required volume, notes repeated with small differences, differences too small to register. The repetition erased them. Time passed without separating itself into moments worth noting. Morning resembled afternoon. Afternoon resembled evening. Light shifted gradually. Orpheus did not track it. Tracking would have implied direction. Direction did not apply. Eurydice's absence did not expand. It did not contract. It remained consistent, a fixed element within the rhythm, not painful, not comforting. Simply there. The music learned to move around it. Notes lingered slightly longer. Silence followed without interruption. Neither state felt incomplete. Days continued to layer over one another. No single day stood apart. Memory flattened, not erased, smoothed. Orpheus did not recall when he had first begun to play this way. The distinction no longer mattered. He played because playing continued. The instrument rested against him. The paths remained. People passed. The world accepted the sound without reaction, and because nothing changed, nothing needed attention. Eventually, even the idea of Eurydice became less specific. Not forgotten, unsharpened, she remained as presence without form, as rhythm without voice. The story no longer progressed. It stabilized, like a sound that has been playing long enough to disappear into the background, and while the music continued in this unchanged way, there was no reason to listen closely. No reason to follow the sequence. It was enough that it remained. Nothing arrived to interrupt the pattern. The sound remained steady without needing to be maintained. Orpheus did not prepare to begin playing. He simply found himself already doing it. The instrument rested against his body as if it had always been there. Its weight felt familiar, not heavy, not light, just present. His fingers moved without searching. They did not hesitate. They followed paths they had followed too many times to count. The notes formed without emphasis. No single sound asked to be remembered. Each note existed only long enough to be replaced by the next. People continued to pass. Some paused briefly, some moved on. Neither response altered the rhythm. The music did not adapt itself to the listener. It remained unchanged. If attention followed it, it passed through. If attention drifted, the music remained. The space beside Orpheus stayed empty, not noticeably, not in a way that demanded recognition. It was simply not occupied. The absence did not grow louder. It did not echo. It stayed at the same volume as everything else. Orpheus walked the same routes. Stones lay where they always had. Shadows fell in familiar shapes. Light shifted without signal. The day did not announce itself. The night did not conclude anything. Time moved as it always had, not forward, not backward, just on. Sometimes the music softened, sometimes it did not. The difference did not matter. The repetition absorbed it. Silence appeared between notes. Not as interruption. As spacing, the silence felt complete. It did not ask to be filled. Orpheus did not recall when Eurydice's absence had stopped surprising him. Surprise required contrast. Contrast no longer applied. She remained as part of the rhythm, not visible, not audible, but consistent. The music learned to exist with that consistency. Notes lingered just long enough, then moved on. Nothing remained behind, days layered without separation. One did not conclude before the next began. Memory did not collect details. It allowed them to pass. The story stopped moving. It spread. It filled time without shape. And because nothing changed, it became unnecessary to follow the sequence. Listening became optional. The sound existed whether it was followed or not. The absence remained without sharpness. The rhythm continued without instruction, and it was enough that it continued. Time no longer separated itself into segments that could be followed. It remained continuous, without edges. Orpheus did not notice when one day gave way to another. Light shifted slowly enough to avoid marking the change. The instrument stayed close, not held tightly, not set aside. It belonged exactly where it was. His hands returned to the strings without intention. They did not search for a beginning. They resumed from wherever they happened to be. The sound emerged already settled. It did not rise. It did not fall. It hovered at the same level it had found long ago. People moved around him as part of the same rhythm. Footsteps crossed paths. Voices appeared briefly, then receded. None of them stayed long enough to alter the atmosphere. The music did not compete with these sounds. It blended. It allowed space. The empty place beside Orpheus remained unchanged. It did not invite replacement. It did not resist memory. It simply stayed empty, and because it stayed empty, it stopped being noticed. Absence became background, not something removed, something settled. Orpheus walked without measuring distance. His pace did not change, not when the ground sloped, not when it leveled. Movement required no adjustment. The body remembered what to do. Breathing followed without effort. Inhale, exhale, pause. The pause extended comfortably. The music followed breath rather than leading it. Notes appeared when there was room for them. They left when there was not. Silence did not interrupt. It completed the sound. Sometimes Orpheus stood still while playing, sometimes he walked. The difference did not register. Both felt identical. Time passed without announcing progress. There was no sense that anything was approaching. No sense that anything had been left behind. Eurydice remained as a quiet constant, not as a memory replayed. As a condition accepted, the music no longer reacted to that condition. It had adapted. Notes did not stretch. They did not shorten. They simply existed. Days continued to overlap. Memory flattened further. Specific moments dissolved. What remained was only the continuation. The act of playing, the act of walking, the act of being present without needing to define it. The story no longer unfolded. It stayed open, like a sound that has been playing long enough to disappear into the air itself. And because nothing changed, nothing asked to be followed, you can listen without tracking. You can let go without missing anything. The rhythm will continue exactly as it is, whether it's noticed or not. Nothing in the space signaled completion. There was no sense that anything had reached its limit. The sound continued because it had not stopped. Orpheus did not begin or end his playing. He simply remained within it. The instrument stayed where it belonged, not held with care, not neglected. It existed as part of his movement. His fingers returned to familiar positions. They did not search. They did not hesitate. They rested where repetition had placed them. The notes formed without structure, not random, not designed. They followed the path that required the least effort. The sound neither pushed forward nor pulled back. It settled into the air and remained there just long enough. People continued to move past. Some slowed, some did not. The difference did not register. The music did not ask to be acknowledged. It allowed attention to pass through it. The space beside Orpheus remained unchanged, not newly empty, not actively remembered. It simply existed without being filled. Absence did not grow, it stabilized. It became part of the environment. Orpheus walked without checking his direction. The path did not need confirmation. His feet found their place without thought. The ground felt the same under each step. Breathing continued at an even pace, not counted, not controlled. Between breaths there was space. That space remained open. Nothing entered it. Nothing needed to. The music adjusted itself to that openness. Notes lingered and then faded. Silence followed without weight. The two states balanced without effort. Time moved without shaping itself into moments. Morning did not claim identity. Evening did not conclude anything. Light passed over familiar surfaces. Shadows appeared and dissolved. None of it asked to be tracked. Eurydice's absence remained consistent, not sharper, not softer. It no longer contrasted with presence. It existed on the same level as everything else. The music no longer responded to it. It had become neutral. Days continued to overlap without separation. Memory released detail without resistance. What remained was repetition. Not boredom, stability. The story did not advance. It did not retreat. It stayed exactly where it was. And because it stayed, there was nothing to follow. You can continue listening, or you can let the sound fade into rest. Either way, the rhythm remains. The rhythm no longer suggested movement. It existed without implying direction. Orpheus remained within it without checking where it led. The instrument stayed close, its presence neither questioned nor adjusted. It belonged there in the same way the ground belonged beneath his feet. His hands returned to the strings without deciding to do so. They followed memory that no longer felt like memory. It felt like placement. The notes emerged without sequence. They did not form a melody that asked to be followed. They rested briefly in the air and then dissolved. The air accepted them without resistance. People continued their motion around him. Some footsteps crossed paths. Some voices surfaced and faded. The music did not compete. It allowed space for everything else to exist beside it. The empty place next to Orpheus did not change. It was no longer noticed as absence. It was simply unoccupied. And because it remained unoccupied, it required no adjustment. Orpheus walked without counting steps. Distance did not accumulate. Each step replaced the last without consequence. The ground did not vary. The pace remained even. Breathing continued in a slow, consistent pattern. Inhale, exhale, pause. The pause felt natural. Nothing pressed into it. The music followed breath rather than leading it. Sometimes sound appeared. Sometimes silence lasted longer. Neither felt incomplete. Light shifted gradually, not enough to mark a moment. Shadows moved without drawing attention. The day did not announce itself. The night did not close anything. Time remained wide, not narrow, not segmented. Eurydice's absence remained unchanged. It did not demand memory. It did not ask to be named. It stayed as part of the atmosphere. The music did not respond to it. It no longer needed to. Days layered gently over one another. No single day claimed identity. Memory softened further. Details lost their edges. What remained was continuity. The act of walking. The act of playing. The act of remaining present without effort. The story did not move forward. It rested exactly where it was. And because nothing progressed, nothing needed to be followed. Listening could loosen. Attention could drift. The rhythm would continue without instruction. It does not require awareness. It does not require memory. It remains whether it is noticed or not. Nothing shifted enough to create a boundary. The rhythm did not loosen. It did not tighten. It remained exactly as it had settled. Orpheus did not feel as though he was continuing. Continuation implied awareness. Awareness had softened. He existed inside the repetition without tracking it. The instrument stayed near, its shape familiar without being examined. The surface felt the same each time it was touched, not smoother, not rougher, just known. His fingers moved without seeking variation. They did not improve. They did not decline. They returned to what had already been learned. The notes emerged without intention. They did not ask to be arranged. They occupied the air briefly and then released it. Silence followed without tension. The silence did not feel empty. It felt complete. People passed as they always had. Some noticed the sound without stopping. Some did not notice at all. Both responses blended into the same background. The music did not respond. It did not need to. The place beside Orpheus remained unchanged. It did not draw attention through contrast. It no longer registered as absence. It was simply space. Unoccupied, undisturbed, Orpheus walked without marking distance. Each step replaced the previous one without accumulation. The ground did not suggest progress. It offered stability. Breathing remained slow and even. Inhale, exhale. The space between breaths lengthened slightly, not enough to be noticed, enough to feel natural. The music adjusted itself to that spacing. Notes waited until there was room, then appeared, then faded. Light moved across familiar shapes. Shadows softened without signaling time. Morning did not begin. Evening did not conclude. The day existed as a continuous state. Eurydice's absence did not shift. It did not call attention to itself. It did not recede. It remained steady, like the ground, like the air. The music had learned how to exist within that steadiness. It did not respond. It did not resist. It simply continued. Days layered without separation. Memory loosened its grip. Specific moments lost relevance. What remained was only the act, walking, playing, remaining. The story did not advance. It did not return. It stayed open. And because it stayed open, nothing needed to be held in mind. You can listen without following. You can drift without missing anything. The rhythm does not require attention. It does not require completion. It remains exactly as it is. There was no internal signal to mark how long it had been this way. Duration no longer felt measurable. It existed as a wide, even surface with nothing rising from it. Orpheus did not consider whether he had played for hours or for days. The difference no longer applied. His hands continued their familiar motion. Not precisely the same, close enough that variation dissolved, the instrument responded without emphasis. Strings vibrated, sound appeared, sound faded. No single note asked to be remembered. Each existed only until it was replaced by the next moment of quiet. The quiet did not rush in. It was already there. The music rested inside it rather than breaking it. People passed through the space without changing it. Footsteps crossed and moved on. Voices surfaced briefly and softened. Everything settled back into the same level of sound. The music did not compete. It did not retreat. It stayed. The space beside Orpheus remained unchanged for so long that it stopped feeling like space. It became part of the shape of the day, not filled, not empty, just there. Orpheus walked without sensing distance. The path did not lengthen, it did not shorten, it simply continued beneath his steps. The ground accepted each footfall without response. Breathing followed a slow, uncounted rhythm. Inhale, exhale. The pause between them expanded gently, not enough to feel deliberate, enough to feel settled. The music adjusted itself to that pause. Notes waited until there was room. Sometimes the room stayed open longer. Nothing hurried to fill it. Silence did not feel like waiting. It felt complete. Light shifted so gradually that it never arrived anywhere. Shadows softened and then dissolved. No moment marked transition. Morning and evening lost their difference. The day did not progress. It remained. Eurydice's absence did not sharpen or fade. It stayed at the same depth it had reached long ago. It no longer contrasted with presence. It became another stable element of the rhythm. The music did not respond to it. Response would have implied change. Change no longer applied. Days layered until they stopped being distinguishable. Memory loosened further. Specific images no longer surfaced. What remained was only continuation, movement without destination, sound without message, presence without effort. The story did not move forward, it did not circle back. It spread outward until it no longer felt like a story, it felt like background. Like air moving through a familiar place, like footsteps that pass without being counted, listening no longer required attention. Attention could drift without consequence. Nothing would be missed. Nothing would be lost. The rhythm would remain exactly as it is, unchanged, uninterrupted. And because nothing asks to be held in mind, you are free to stop following, free to rest. The sound will continue whether it is noticed or not. Nothing new arrives. That becomes clear after enough time has passed without distinction. The sound continues because it has always continued, not forward, not backward, simply present. Orpheus no longer adjusts his pace. There is no need. The ground accepts each step as it always has. The air carries sound and releases it without effort. Notes rise only to settle back into the same quiet they came from. There is no emphasis. No part asks to be held. The instrument rests against his body as though it has grown there. Hands move without instruction. They do not search for the next note. They already know where it will be. Time does not stretch. It does not compress. It spreads evenly in all directions. Listening becomes optional. Awareness loosens without consequence. If attention drifts, nothing changes. If it stays, nothing deepens. The rhythm remains complete either way. Eurydice exists only as a settled shape within the pattern, not remembered, not anticipated, simply present as absence has become present. The days do not accumulate. They dissolve as soon as they arrive. There is no sense of before, no sense of after, only continuation. Sound fills the space and leaves it unchanged. Silence follows and feels whole. Breathing slows without instruction. Inhale arrives when it arrives. Exhale leaves without being counted. The pause between them widens naturally. Nothing rushes to fill it. Nothing needs to. The world does not move on. It rests. The story no longer unfolds. It settles into stillness. It does not end. It becomes unnecessary. You do not need to follow the sound. You do not need to remember who is walking or why. The rhythm continues without observation. And while it continues, attention may soften, thought may drift, and the space between moments may widen gently until nothing remains that requires holding. That was the quiet story of Orpheus and Eurydice, a story that moved slowly and ended without resolution. There is nothing you need to remember from it, nothing to follow forward. We'll take a short moment here before continuing with another familiar Greek myth. It will be told just as calmly and just as gently. You don't need to prepare for it. It will begin on its own. The stone is already moving. It has been moving for longer than this moment. Sisyphus is already behind it, his hands pressed where they always rest. There is no need to adjust his grip. The pressure feels familiar. The ground beneath his feet, offers the same resistance it always has. The slope continues upward without variation. Each step lands where it has landed before. The movement does not speed up. It does not slow down. It remains steady. Breath moves in and out without attention. Inhale, exhale, the sound blends into everything else. There is no marker to measure progress. The top of the hill is not a goal, it is simply part of the landscape. The stone rolls because it must. Sisyphus walks because there is space to walk. The weight remains constant, not heavier, not lighter, just present. Time does not announce itself. It passes the same way the stone does. Quietly, the sky above remains unchanged. Light stays even. Nothing suggests that this moment is different from the one before it. The stone continues upward. Sisyphus continues with it. The slope does not change. If it has changed at any point, there is no way to tell. The ground feels the same beneath his feet, firm in the same places, slightly uneven where it always is. The stone rolls forward a small distance at a time. It does not hurry. It does not resist. It responds to the same steady pressure. Sisyphus does not think about where he is. There is no reason to. The position of his body has been memorized. His shoulders lean forward just enough. His arms remain extended, never fully straight, never fully bent. The angle is familiar. Breath continues without instruction. Inhale, exhale. The sound remains quiet, almost unnoticed. There is no count. There is no rhythm to follow beyond what already exists. The movement repeats. Step, pressure, roll, step, pressure, roll. The stone advances and the space behind it fills again. Nothing is left behind, nothing is gained. The top of the slope does not feel closer. It does not feel farther. It remains where it has always been. Time stretches without becoming heavy. Moments pass without separating themselves. There is no pause long enough to feel like rest. There is no effort sharp enough to feel like strain. The work exists in the middle space. The stone continues to move. Sisyphus continues with it. The sky does not react. The air does not shift. There is no sound to mark how long this has been happening. If there is a beginning, it is not here. If there is an end, it is not approaching. Only the motion remains. The stone rolls upward, steady and unchanged. And Sisyphus remains behind it, exactly where he has always been. The pressure against the stone stays even. There is no moment when it feels lighter in his hands. There is no moment when it becomes too heavy to continue. The weight exists in a narrow range, comfortable only because it is expected. Sisyphus shifts his footing slightly, not to adjust the task, but because the ground asks for it in the same place every time. The movement does not interrupt the rhythm. It blends back in without effort. The stone rolls forward another small distance. The surface of it feels familiar against his palms. The same rough edges, the same worn areas. His hands return to the same positions without searching. Breath continues. There is no thought attached to it. The air enters. The air leaves. Nothing needs to be corrected. The slope remains consistent, not steep enough to demand urgency, not gentle enough to allow forgetting. The balance holds. Step follows step. The sound of movement is soft and unremarkable, stone against ground, foot against earth. The sounds repeat until they no longer stand out. Time moves without marking itself. There is no change in light to suggest progress. The sky remains still. If clouds pass, they do so without drawing attention. The work does not respond to them. The stone continues upward. Sisyphus remains behind it. There is no tension in the movement, no anticipation, only continuation. The space ahead of him opens gradually. The space behind him fills again. Nothing accumulates, nothing diminishes. The motion holds. And so it continues without variation, without urgency, without end. The stone moves. The slope remains. Sisyphus stays with the motion. The movement carries on for a while longer, not longer than usual, not shorter, just long enough to feel familiar. The stone continues to roll upward until the slope begins to soften, not suddenly, gradually. The resistance under Sisyphus' feet changes almost imperceptibly. The pressure against the stone eases for a brief moment, not enough to matter, not enough to change anything. And then, as it always does, the motion shifts. The stone slows, not because Sisyphus stops pushing, not because the path ends. It slows because this is the point where it always slows. There is no surprise in it. The stone hesitates for a fraction of a moment, balanced between movement and stillness, and then it rolls back. Not violently, not dramatically, it simply returns the way it always has, down the same slope, along the same path. The sound it makes is quiet and familiar. Sisyphus does not follow it with his eyes for long. There is no need. He waits, not impatiently, not with resignation, just waiting. The stone settles where it always settles. The ground accepts it without reaction. The space resets itself. Sisyphus steps forward. His hands find the stone again. The surface feels unchanged. The position is correct. There is nothing new to consider. The next movement does not require a decision. It begins because it always does. And in this way the work continues, not as punishment, not as struggle, as repetition, as routine, as something that does not end and therefore does not need attention. Eventually, even the idea of following the motion becomes unnecessary. You do not need to imagine the stone clearly. You do not need to track the steps. The pattern is already complete. It repeats on its own. And this is where the story of Sisyphus rests, not because it stops, but because nothing changes anymore. And this is where the stories come to rest. There is nowhere else to go. The movements have slowed enough to no longer need attention. Nothing more will begin. Nothing needs to continue. You don't need to remember which story came first or which one followed. They have all settled into the same quiet space. The rhythm remains even as the details fade. Breath continues, time passes, and the mind is free to let go. There is nothing left to listen for, nothing left to follow, only rest. The stone rests only for a moment, not because it has stopped, but because movement has paused exactly where it always does. That pause is familiar, so familiar that it does not feel like waiting. Sisyphus stands behind the stone without shifting his weight. His body remains aligned with the task as if still pushing. The space around him does not change. The hill does not reset. The air does not react. Only the direction of movement has ended. For now, time behaves differently here, not slower, not faster, flatter. Moments no longer stack. They spread outward and thin. The pause does not ask how long it will last, because the pause has happened before. Sisyphus does not look down the hill. There is no need to watch the stone settle. He already knows where it will stop. He already knows how long it will remain still. This knowledge does not feel earned. It does not feel remembered. It simply exists. Breath continues without sound. Inhale arrives softly. Exhale leaves without notice. The body remains prepared even while resting. Not tense, not relaxed, ready without expectation. The ground beneath his feet feels unchanged. The same unevenness, the same firmness. If he were to step now, his foot would land exactly where it always does. But he does not step yet. The pause completes itself. And then, without instruction, without decision, movement returns. Hands press into stone. The pressure is familiar. The work resumes before thought arrives. There was a time when thought tried to accompany the movement. That time is no longer present. Thought has learned that it is unnecessary here. The stone does not respond to intention. The hill does not change with effort. Only repetition remains. Sisyphus does not wonder how long this has lasted. The question would have no surface to rest on. Duration has worn smooth. There is no contrast between beginning and continuation. The motion exists without narrative, step, pressure, roll. The pattern requires nothing else. The mind follows for a while and then loosens. Attention fades without consequence. The body continues accurately. Hands return to the same places. Feet find the same ground. Even if awareness drifts, the motion holds. Nothing collapses, nothing deviates. The stone continues upward because it always has. The work no longer belongs to effort. It belongs to the environment, like wind passing through the same opening, like water moving along a worn path. Sisyphus is part of that path now, not separate from it, not resisting it, simply within it. The return of the stone does not interrupt the work. It completes it. Downward movement belongs to the task as much as upward effort. The sound of the stone rolling back is not loss. It is transition. Sisyphus does not react when the weight leaves his hands. There is no relief. There is no disappointment. Only space where pressure had been. That space closes naturally as he steps forward again. Hands meet stone. The cycle seals itself. Nothing carries over from one repetition to the next. No memory accumulates. No fatigue sharpens. The task does not grow heavier because it does not grow at all. It remains the same size every time. And because it remains the same, it does not demand emotion. Emotion would require difference. Difference does not arrive. The hill remains. The stone remains. The motion remains. And Sisyphus remains exactly where the motion needs him. You do not need to follow the stone. You do not need to imagine the slope. The repetition already exists without attention. If your focus softens, the motion continues. If your thoughts drift, nothing is lost. The story does not progress. It circulates. You do not need to remember where this began. You do not need to stay with each movement. The rhythm holds itself. Breath slows on its own. Pauses widen without being counted. The space between moments grows gentle. And somewhere, without urgency, without change, the stone continues to move, the hill remains, and the work repeats exactly as it always has, quiet enough to no longer require listening. The hill no longer feels tall or shallow. It has lost its shape, not because it has changed, but because shape requires comparison. Sisyphus no longer compares where he is to where he has been. The slope exists only where his foot lands. Everything else is unnecessary. The ground ahead does not matter yet. The ground behind has already released him. Only the immediate contact remains. Stone beneath palms, earth beneath feet. Nothing else asks to be noticed. The sky does not suggest height. The horizon does not suggest distance. They exist, but without instruction. If the hill were to vanish, the motion would remain. If the stone were unseen, the pressure would still be there. The work no longer depends on its surroundings. It carries itself. Step follows step without awareness of direction. Upward and downward have softened into the same movement. The difference no longer matters. Sisyphus does not register when the slope subtly changes. The body adjusts before thought could arrive. Adjustment happens without recognition. There is no moment where balance feels threatened. There is no moment where stability is earned. Everything remains inside a narrow, familiar range. The stone presses back with the same weight. The hands accept it without evaluation. Time no longer sits inside the movement. It spreads thin, like light diffused through dust. Moments do not stack, they overlap. The work does not happen in time. Time happens around the work. And slowly, even the idea of hill loosens. What remains is only motion continuing itself. The motion continues without confirming itself. There is no signal that it has begun again. It is already happening by the time it could be noticed. Sisyphus does not mark the return of the stone as a new moment. It does not feel new. It feels expected in a way that no longer needs thought. His hands meet the stone where they always do, not because he remembers, but because memory is no longer involved. The body arrives first. Thought, if it appears at all, arrives later and finds nothing left to do. The stone does not wait. It accepts pressure the same way it always has, not as resistance, not as cooperation, simply as response. The surface of the stone is no longer observed. Roughness and smoothness have lost their distinction. What remains is contact. The hands do not register where one edge ends and another begins. They know the shape without needing to see it. The hill beneath his feet no longer suggests effort. Effort requires contrast. Here there is none. Each step lands with the same certainty as the step before it, not confidence, not hesitation, just placement. The ground does not surprise him. Even unevenness has become predictable. Where the earth dips, the body adjusts before imbalance can form. Where the surface hardens, pressure distributes itself without instruction. The movement corrects itself again and again without drawing attention. Breath continues without rhythm. It does not follow steps. It does not follow strain. It exists as a parallel motion. Air enters, air leaves. No part of the work depends on it consciously. Time stretches further here, not longer wider. Moments do not follow one another. They sit beside each other without order. The idea of before and after loosens its grip. If this motion has happened 1,000 times, it does not feel repetitive. Repetition requires awareness. Here, awareness has thinned. The stone moves because movement remains available. Sisyphus walks because walking has not stopped. The hill does not challenge him. It does not assist him. It simply allows the movement to continue. There is no sense of progress, but there is also no sense of being held back. The absence of progress no longer feels like failure. Failure would require an expectation. Expectation has faded. The top of the hill exists as a concept without urgency. It does not pull the motion forward. It does not promise relief. It is simply another place where the stone sometimes arrives before leaving again. When the slope subtly shifts, the body responds, not because it anticipates the return, but because response has become automatic. The slight easing of resistance does not register as relief. Relief implies tension being released. Here, tension never fully formed. The slowing of the stone does not signal an ending. It signals what always happens next. The stone hesitates, not dramatically, not meaningfully, just long enough to acknowledge gravity without naming it. Then it rolls back. Downward motion feels no different from upward motion now. Direction has softened. The body does not chase the stone. It waits. Waiting does not feel passive. It feels complete. The sound of the stone returning does not echo loudly. It settles into the background of everything else. Sisyphus does not watch where it stops. He knows without looking. The space resets itself without instruction. The hill does not remember what just happened. Neither does he. Hands return to the stone, not eagerly, not reluctantly, simply returning. Grip forms without searching. The angle is correct. It always is. The push begins without being decided. And somewhere within this cycle, the distinction between task and self begins to thin. There is less sense of doing the work, more sense of being within it. The stone moves, Sisyphus moves. The movement exists without ownership. It does not belong to the stone. It does not belong to the hill. It does not belong to Sisyphus. It simply continues. The sky above does not mark time. Light remains even. If shadows shift, they do so quietly. Nothing responds to them. The work remains unchanged. Eventually, even the idea of effort becomes unnecessary. What remains is consistency, not enforced, not chosen, maintained by the absence of interruption. The motion has no climax, it has no resolution, it has no lesson. And because nothing is being learned, nothing needs to be remembered. The story dissolves into repetition. Repetition dissolves into stillness that moves. And at this point, you no longer need to picture the hill. You do not need to follow the stone. The rhythm exists without imagery. The motion continues without description, and the mind does not need to stay with it. It can rest beside it. Let the movement continue on its own. It will not stop because it does not need you, and you do not need it to finish. It is already complete in its continuation. There is no longer a clear sense of how long the movement has been happening, not because it is endless, but because duration has stopped being useful. The body no longer tracks how many times the stone has returned. Counting would require separation. Here, everything blends. The moment of pushing and the moment of waiting are no longer distinct. They flow into each other without a seam. Sisyphus does not anticipate the return of the stone. Anticipation requires a future that feels different from the present. Here, the future feels identical. The stone rolls upward and the body follows. The stone rolls back and the body pauses. Neither motion feels more important than the other. Pause is not rest. Movement is not effort. They exist as equal states. The muscles in his arms no longer signal strain. They no longer signal release. They simply hold a shape that has proven stable. Stability replaces intention. The body has learned exactly how much pressure can exist without needing adjustment. That amount does not change. If the stone shifts slightly, the body shifts with it, not reactively, simultaneously. There is no gap where thought could enter. Thought would arrive late. By the time it appeared, the movement would already be complete, so thought stops arriving, or if it arrives, it does not stay. It drifts through without attaching itself to anything. The hill no longer feels like a place. It feels like a condition, something that exists only while movement exists. Without the stone, the hill would not matter. Without the hill, the stone would not matter. Without the movement, neither would exist at all. The sky above has lost its distance. It is no longer above. It is simply present. Light does not move across it in a way that signals passing hours. If light changes, it does so too slowly to mark. Shadows soften, edges blur, nothing sharp remains. The sound of the stone against the ground has thinned. It does not register as noise anymore. It has become texture, a quiet layer beneath everything else. Footsteps follow the same pattern, not loud enough to interrupt, not quiet enough to disappear. They exist only long enough to make the next step possible. The idea of an observer has faded. There is no sense that anyone is watching. There is no sense that anyone ever did. The gods are not present here. Not because they have left, but because presence is no longer relevant. Judgment requires comparison. Comparison requires difference. Here difference has dissolved. The work is no longer punishment, but it is also no longer meaning. Meaning would imply that something is being achieved. Here achievement has no place. The stone does not teach. The hill does not test. Sisyphus does not endure. The movement simply remains. At some point, even the word movement becomes inaccurate. Movement implies change of position. Here, position feels constant even as motion continues. The body is always here. The stone is always here. The hill is always here. Only the arrangement shifts slightly and then returns. Time folds inward. Moments stop lining up. Instead of passing, they overlap. One push exists inside the memory of another push. One pause rests inside the expectation of the next. But expectation does not feel forward. It feels circular. Like standing inside something that turns slowly without edges. If there was once a beginning, it has been worn smooth. If there will be an ending, it has not announced itself. The work does not wait for it. The work does not need it. The stone rolls. Hands press. Feet step. And somewhere within this repetition, identity loosens, not disappears, loosens. Sisyphus is no longer defined by the act. The act is no longer defined by Sisyphus. They exist as a single quiet pattern, a pattern that does not expand, a pattern that does not resolve. Just steady enough to continue. And at this point, there is no reason to stay focused. Nothing will change if attention drifts. The movement does not require being witnessed. It does not require being followed. It continues whether it is noticed or not. You do not need to imagine the stone anymore. You do not need to picture the hill. You can let the image fade. The rhythm will remain. Breath will continue. Time will pass without needing shape. And the work, unchanged, uninterrupted, will carry on somewhere behind thought. At some point, the idea of a figure behind the stone becomes less precise. There is still pressure, there is still contact, but the boundary between hands and stone no longer feels important. The weight presses and something presses back. Which part belongs to the body and which part belongs to the stone is no longer examined. Examination would require distance. Here there is none. The motion does not feel personal. It does not feel owned. It does not feel endured. It simply occurs. Breath continues without being claimed. The chest rises. The chest falls. There is no sense that someone is breathing. Breathing is simply happening in the same way the stone is moving. Muscles no longer announce themselves. There is no signal of effort. There is no signal of fatigue. The body has settled into a shape that requires nothing further. Even the idea of body begins to soften. There is pressure. There is movement. There is continuation. Labels fade. If attention tries to locate a center, it slips. There is no single point where everything gathers. The movement is distributed. Hands, feet, breath, ground, stone, none of them lead. None of them follow. They exist in a quiet agreement. Time no longer feels like something that surrounds the work. It feels embedded inside it, not passing, not accumulating, just present as a thin layer spread evenly across everything. Moments do not feel sequential. They feel stacked without order. One push does not replace another. It exists alongside it. The idea of again no longer applies. Repetition requires memory. Memory requires separation. Here, everything overlaps too gently to separate. If the stone rolls back, there is no sense of loss. If it moves upward, there is no sense of gain. Direction has lost meaning. Upward is not progress. Downward is not failure. They are simply two textures within the same surface. The hill does not feel external. It feels internal, not inside the body, but inside the movement itself. There is no edge where the world ends and the act begins. They have merged. Silence is no longer noticeable because nothing interrupts it. Sound is no longer noticeable because it never asserts itself. Everything has lowered to the same level. Nothing rises above anything else. Awareness loosens its grip. Not suddenly, not intentionally. It loosens because there is nothing left that needs holding. Thought may appear. If it does, it passes through without attaching. It does not comment. It does not question. It does not stay. Even the idea that this is a story begins to dissolve. Stories require change. Here, change has finished happening. What remains does not move forward, it does not move backward, it sustains itself. And somewhere within this steady state, identity thins, not erased, just unnecessary. There is no need for a name, no need for a reason, no need for an outcome. The movement does not ask who performs it. It does not ask why it continues. It continues because it already is. And at this point, you do not need to imagine anything at all. The image can fade. The stone can blur. The hill can soften. What remains is the rhythm, quiet, even, uninterrupted. Breath continues. Time rests. And whatever is moving does so without needing to be known. Nothing needs to move forward anymore. Nothing needs to return. The rhythm has settled into a place where direction no longer matters. There is no effort left to describe, no action left to follow, only a steady presence that does not shift. Breath continues because breath always continues. Inhale arrives without announcement. Exhale leaves without delay. There is no space between them that needs attention. Time no longer feels like time. It does not stretch. It does not pass. It simply rests inside the moment. Awareness softens until it no longer holds an edge. There is no need to stay with the words. They can fade. The meaning has already dissolved. The sound of the voice becomes texture, not information, not story, just a layer of calm moving through silence. If thoughts appear, they do not stay. They pass the same way sound passes. Nothing is held, nothing is lost. The body rests without being told to rest. The mind loosens without instruction. There is no task left to complete, no story left to remember. Everything that needed to repeat has already repeated enough. Now even repetition can release. What remains does not require attention. It does not require listening. It simply exists. And it is perfectly fine if you stop following the words now. Perfectly fine if awareness drifts. Perfectly fine if sleep arrives without being noticed. Nothing will change. Nothing will be missed. The rhythm will continue without you. The silence will hold, and everything can rest exactly as it is. If this rhythm feels familiar, you can return to it again. New stories appear here quietly when they are ready. You don't need to do anything now, just rest.